At 3:47 hours on June 2nd, 1944, Captain Jean-Pierre Moreau sat in a cramped attic in Calais, France, staring at a coded message he had just transmitted to London. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the realization of what he had just done. The Morse key was still warm under his fingertips. The faint smell of burning vacuum tubes hung in the air. Outside the attic window, Calais slept under German occupation. Inside, Moreau had just made a catastrophic error. In his haste to encode the intelligence about German troop movements, he had used yesterday's cipher key instead of today's. The attic was silent except for the ticking of his watch. 0348. Zego 349. Each second that passed meant the signal was traveling farther into the ether, bouncing off the ionosphere, racing toward receiving stations across occupied Europe, including German listening posts. Every agent in the French resistance network knew the protocol. Wrong cipher meant compromised transmission. Compromised transmission meant the Gestapo could trace the signal. And if the Gestapo traced the signal, the direction-finding trucks would be rolling through the streets of Calais within the hour. Everyone in the network would be dead by sunrise. Moreau pressed his palms against the rough wooden table, the table where he had transmitted 247 messages over 18 months. 247 perfect encryptions. 0 errors. Until tonight. He was 29 years old, a mathematics professor from the University of Lyon before the war, specialized in number theory and cryptography. In 1940, when France fell, Moreau had been teaching a seminar on prime factorization. By 1942, British intelligence had recruited him for his gift with numbers and codes. They trained him at a manor house outside London, Morse code until his fingers cramped, cipher systems until he could encode in his sleep, fieldcraft, dead drops, recognition signals. They told him the average life expectancy of a radio operator in occupied France was 6 weeks. Moreau had lasted 18 months. The message he had just transmitted contained the locations of 3 panzer divisions positioned near the Pas-de-Calais coastline. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Panzer Lehr Division Critical Intelligence. The kind of information that could save thousands of Allied lives during the upcoming invasion that everyone knew was coming, but nobody would name. But now, because of one stupid mistake made at 3 in the morning when his hands were cold and his mind was tired, that intelligence was compromised, or so Moreau believed. He reached for the codebook hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Flaubert's Madame Bovary. He checked the cipher schedule again. June 2nd, key Delta 7. He had used key Delta 6, yesterday's key, a key the British had abandoned at midnight, which meant if the Germans had broken it during its operational period, they could now read his message as clearly as if he had transmitted it in plain text. Moreau stood up. The attic was freezing. May in northern France. He could see his breath in the moonlight coming through the single window. He had 2 choices. He could pack the radio, destroy the codebooks, and run. Or he could wait for London's response. If you want to see how one man's error turned into one of the greatest intelligence coups of World War II, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. What Moreau did not know was that his mistake had just activated one of the most elaborate deceptions in military history. 600 miles away in London, at a nondescript building on Grosvenor Street that housed the headquarters of the 20 Committee, Major Thomas Robertson was reading Moreau's message. Robertson was 34 years old, Scottish. Before the war, he had been a banker. Now he was one of the architects of Operation Fortitude, the massive Allied deception operation designed to convince Hitler that the D-Day invasion would land at Calais instead of Normandy. Robertson's office was thick with cigarette smoke. It was past midnight in London. He had been awake for 19 hours. On his desk were reports from double agents across Europe. On the wall was a map of France with colored pins showing German troop concentrations. And in his hand was Moreau's message, decoded from the captured transmission. Robertson saw the wrong cipher key immediately. The message had been transmitted on frequency 7.835 MHz at 0347 hours. Received by a British listening station in Kent at 0349, decoded by 0352, and flagged by 0353 because the cipher key was wrong. Standard protocol was clear. Send an urgent message to Moreau telling him to go dark, assume his position was compromised, destroy the radio, burn the codebooks, run. But Robertson didn't send that message. He stood at the window, looking out at blacked-out London. Barrage balloons floated over the Thames like sleeping whales. Searchlights probed the clouds for German bombers that hadn't come tonight. Robertson was thinking about the way deception worked, the way belief systems operated. The Germans weren't just listening to resistance radio traffic. They were obsessed with it. Robertson knew this because British intelligence had broken the German Enigma codes. They could read German radio intercepts about French resistance transmissions. German intelligence had created an entire department dedicated to monitoring and decoding Allied agent traffic. They had broken several older British Cipher systems. They monitored every frequency between 3 and 30 megahertz. They analyzed every transmission, looking for patterns, repetitions, errors. And when they intercepted Moreau's message encoded with yesterday's cipher, a cipher they had already broken during its operational window, they would be able to read it. The mathematics were brutal. If the Germans could read the message, they would learn about 3 panzer divisions near Calais. They would learn that Allied intelligence was tracking those divisions. They would assume the Allies were interested in Calais because the Allies were planning to invade at Calais, which was exactly what Operation Fortitude wanted the Germans to believe. But there was a problem. If Robertson told Moreau the cipher was compromised, Moreau would stop transmitting. The Germans would notice the sudden silence. They would become suspicious. The intelligence value would be lost. If Robertson told Moreau to continue transmitting as if nothing had happened, Moreau would be operating on a compromised frequency with a broken cipher. Every message would be readable by German intelligence, which meant every message could be weaponized. Robertson made a decision in less than 30 seconds. He walked to the cipher room and drafted a message. Transmission received. Continue normal operations. Well done. The message was encrypted using the current cipher key and transmitted back to France at 412 hours. In the attic in Calais, Moreau was packing the radio when his receiver clicked to life. He stopped, listened, decoded the message. Continue normal operations. They weren't pulling him out. They weren't shutting down the network, which meant London either hadn't noticed his error or they had noticed and didn't care. Neither possibility made sense. Moreau sat down at the table. He could hear his landlady moving around in the apartment below, Madame Blanchard, 67 years old. She knew what Moreau was doing in her attic. She brought him soup sometimes. She never asked questions. If the Gestapo came, she would die alongside him. But Moreau was a soldier. He followed orders. Over the next 3 days, he transmitted 2 more messages using the compromised cipher. Both messages contained intelligence about Allied preparations for an invasion at Calais. The first message, transmitted on June 3rd at 02:15 hours, reported massive troop concentrations in Dover and Folkestone, American and Canadian divisions. The message included unit designations: the 1st Canadian Army, the US 3rd Army under General Patton, all positioning for a cross-channel assault at the narrowest point. The second message, transmitted on June 5th at 04:03 hours, described landing craft being assembled in ports along the English coast opposite Calais. LCITs, LCIs, LSTs, hundreds of them. The message noted that aerial reconnaissance had spotted additional craft being moved into position. All of it was false. All of it was part of Operation Fortitude. The troop concentrations were real, but they consisted of inflatable tanks and plywood aircraft. The landing craft existed, but most were damaged vessels or decoys. The entire force was a phantom army designed to convince German intelligence that Patton would lead the main invasion at Calais, and Moreau, unknowingly, was the messenger. In Berlin, at the headquarters of the Abwehr on Cipher, German intelligence officers were celebrating. They had intercepted 3 messages from a French resistance operative in Calais. Agent identification, Phoenix. All 3 messages encoded with cipher system Delta 6, a cipher the Abwehr cryptanalysis section had broken in April. The messages confirmed everything German high command suspected. The Allied invasion would come at Calais. The geography made sense. Calais was 21 miles from Dover, the shortest crossing, the fastest route to strike into Germany. Hitler himself believed Calais was the target. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed it. And now, intercepted intelligence from a French spy confirmed it. What the Germans did not know was that Moreau's mistake had been deliberately exploited by British intelligence. Robertson's team had fed Moreau false information through his handler, knowing he would encode it using the compromised cipher, knowing the Germans would intercept it, knowing they would believe it because they thought they were reading stolen secrets. On the morning of June 6, 1944, at 6:30 hours, the first Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. Not Calais, Normandy, 150 miles southwest. 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. The 3 panzer divisions that Moreau had reported near Calais were real. The 1st SS Panzer had 21,000 men and 130 tanks. The 12th SS Panzer had 20,000 men and 150 tanks. Panzerlehr had 15,000 men and 190 tanks. Combined, they represented the most powerful armored force in northern France, but they had been positioned at Calais as part of the deception. When the Normandy invasion began, German High Command refused to move those divisions south. For 7 critical hours, they held the panzers at Calais. They were convinced the Normandy landing was a feint, a diversion. The real invasion, the main assault, was still coming at Calais, because a French spy had made a mistake with his cipher key. Those 7 hours made the difference between success and catastrophic failure on D-Day. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced withering fire from German positions on the bluffs. The 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division took brutal casualties. Nearly 2,500 men killed or wounded in the first 6 hours, but they held the beachhead. They pushed inland. By the time German commanders realized Normandy was the real target, by the time they ordered the panzer divisions to move south from Calais, it was too late. The panzers began their march at 1400 hours on June 6th. They arrived at the Normandy front on June 7th and 8th. By then, Allied forces had established a beachhead 50 miles wide and 10 miles deep. They had landed 156,000 troops. They had secured the beaches. Military historians estimate that if the 3 panzer divisions had reached Normandy in the first 6 hours of the invasion, Allied casualties could have exceeded 10,000 men. The beachhead might not have held. The invasion might have failed. The war might have continued for another year. Instead, because German armor stayed at Calais waiting for an invasion that never came, Allied forces achieved their objective. Moreau didn't learn the truth until August 1944. By then, Paris had been liberated. He had been extracted from France on a Royal Navy MTB that picked him up from a beach near Boulogne-sur-Mer. He was flown to London for debriefing. Major Robertson himself came to the debriefing room at the MI6 headquarters. Robertson explained what had happened, how Moreau's error had been recognized immediately, how Robertson had made the split-second decision to weaponize the mistake instead of containing it, how the compromised cipher had become the delivery mechanism for one of the most successful deceptions of the war, how 3 false messages had convinced the Germans to hold 3 panzer divisions 150 miles from where they were needed most. Moreau listened in silence. He sat at a wooden table in a windowless room. A cup of tea grew cold in front of him. When Robertson finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Moreau asked one question. "Did you tell me to continue transmitting knowing the cipher was broken?" Robertson nodded. "We did. You put the entire network at risk. The Gestapo could have triangulated my position. They could have arrested Madame Blanchard. They could have rolled up the entire Calais cell." "We did," Robertson said again. "But the network wasn't the target. The Germans' belief system was the target. We needed them to intercept intelligence they thought was stolen, intelligence they thought they had obtained through their own skill. Your mistake gave us that opportunity. You gambled with my life. We gambled with thousands of lives," Robertson said quietly. "Yours, mine, the soldiers on those beaches. We chose the gamble that saved the most." There was a long silence in the debriefing room. Through the walls, Moreau could hear the sounds of London, traffic, voices, a city returning to life after years of blackout and bombs. Finally, Moreau spoke. "How many lives?" Robertson didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Estimated 10,000 Allied soldiers, possibly more, if the panzers had reached the beaches in the first wave. We ran the mathematics. 3 armored divisions with air support arriving at Omaha and Gold beaches during the initial assault. The casualties would have been catastrophic. The beachhead would likely have collapsed." Moreau looked at his hands, the same hands that had encoded the wrong cipher key at 0347 hours on June 2nd. The same hands that had transmitted 3 messages over 3 days, never knowing he was the instrument of one of the greatest deceptions in military history. Jean-Pierre Moreau was awarded the Distinguished Service Order in a private ceremony in September 1944. Only 5 people attended. The citation was deliberately vague, for exceptional service to Allied intelligence operations in occupied France. The details remained classified for 30 years. When the files were finally opened in 1974, historians recognized the operation as one of the most elegant examples of information warfare in the Second World War. Moreau returned to France after the war. He resumed his position as a mathematics professor at the University of Lyon. He married in 1947. He had 2 daughters. He taught number theory and cryptography until his retirement in 1975. He never spoke publicly about his work with British intelligence. His family knew he had been in the resistance, but they didn't know the details. He died in 1978 at the age of 63, heart attack. He was buried in Lyon. In his personal papers, found by his daughters after his death, was a single handwritten note tucked inside the same copy of Madame Bovary he had used to hide his codebooks. In mathematics, there are no mistakes, only variables we haven't yet learned to exploit. The wrong cipher key transmitted on June 2, 1944, helped save 10,000 lives 4 days later. Not because it was wrong, but because someone recognized that in deception, sometimes the mistake is the message, sometimes the error is the weapon, and sometimes the greatest victories come from the courage to weaponize failure. Major Thomas Robertson never spoke about his role in Operation Fortitude either. He returned to banking after the war. He died in 1988. The 2 men never met again after that debriefing in August 1944. But their collaboration, born from an accident at 0347 hours in a freezing attic in Calais, changed the course of the war. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jean-Pierre Moreau doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.